Good morning. This is the training for observing and recording. So it's just me again. I did a training yesterday with one of the CDA classes, but there was a lot of breakouts and there just wouldn't have been very much video to observe. So I'm just going to condense it all together here and um, do this recording as the training. So one thing I would recommend to you if you don't have pencil and paper handy that you might grab some, I think would be helpful to you to practice some of the things we're going to go over today with me. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so we're talking about observing and recording. So first of all, what is observation in a childcare setting? So observation is the process of watching a child at work or play without interfering in the activity. But then what is the purpose of observation? By recording their observations, teachers document children's work and the quality of that work or interaction. This information enables them to better evaluate and set goals for that child. Over time, observations of the child can reveal patterns of behavior, learning preferences, mastery of skills, and developmental progress. So it's really important that we are observing children in a formal way. Now, I know that we naturally observe children on a daily basis, notice things they're doing, but when we do it in a formal way, we can utilize it for planning, for meeting goals, for identifying behavioral patterns in children. If you have a child who's having some upset often, um, observation of a formal observation can actually help you to identify triggers and different things that might be going on with the child to help you better meet that child's needs. It's also really important with this formal observation that we're aware of where children are developmentally. And while I know that sometimes in a setting, just we can naturally kind of be aware of that, but really it's so much more precise when we do formal observation. We're so much more aware, we're so much more purposeful. And so it really is important. So what is recording? Recording is the process of documenting this observed activity or behavior. So this is where it becomes formal, where you actually document it. And although many teachers do this naturally, as I said, they observe naturally, a systematic approach helps ensure that children are observed participating in many different activities over time. So, documentation gives you something to reference on different areas of development with the child, and gives you a starting point for planning around activities that you would work on the child with. So, when observing, it's important that we're objective rather than subjective. So, when we start recording our observations, it is very important that we take out opinion. We want to paint a picture with our words. So, I'm going to give you an example of objective observations that are documented and subjective. So, objective observations are just factual statements. For example, Joe picked up the block and threw it at Samuel. That is objective. That's a fact. You can see in your mind what happened, right? Or Marie spent her time outdoors sitting under the tree. Again, a factual statement, exactly what she's doing, paints a picture. You can see it in your mind. Now, here's an example of a subjective observation. Subjective label behaviors and they have judgments. So, in comparison with the first statement that said Joe picked up the block and threw it at Samuel, here is a subjective statement. It says Joe is aggressive. Now, that could look like any number of things. So, if you picture that in your mind, Joe's aggressive, all of us would have a different view of that. Some of us might have a picture of a child with their fist back. Some of us might have a picture of a child running after another child to grab them. Some of us might have a picture of a child knocking things over. Aggressive can be any number of things to each of us, depending upon our past experiences. So we don't really have a picture in our mind of what Joe is doing. And again, it's judgmental, it's labeling. So another example, in the objective example, it said Marie spent her time outdoors sitting under the tree. A subjective statement might be Marie is lazy. Again, that could look like any number of things, right? To any of us. So And also, again, it's a judgment. So labels do not convey information that helps in understanding a child's development. So if I wrote an anecdotal note that said Marie is lazy, how would you plan around that? You have no observation, no factual statements to say this is where she at and this is what needs to happen. Where if I said Marie spent her time outdoors sitting under the tree, there's some things I could take away from that. So she's not interacting with other children. She's not involved in active play. So that might lead me to believe that she needs work on social skills or physical skills, physical development, something of the sort. So it gives me a place to start when I have objective observations that are formed from factual statements. So there are different types of ways to observe and record. So the way that I was just kind of talking about is called an anecdotal note. So these are brief accounts of specific incidents, and they tell a picture in words. They should give factual information about what happened, when it happened, where it happened, the stimulus for the activity, the child's reactions, and how the action ended. Now that sounds like it's going to be a whole long story, right? It doesn't have to be. They, in fact, anecdotal notes should be pretty brief, and I'll give you some examples of them. We're going to really talk about them here in a little bit. So then there's also narratives or diary records. Now the definition here says these are daily notes or impressions of group and individual activities that are recorded at the end of the day. They tend to be somewhat subjective and often capture a quick impression or mood. They are useful for tracing some of the successes and failures of the day's events. So this would be like at the end of the day when you meet with your co-teacher, if you have a co-teacher. And if you don't, it's just you mulling things over, thinking things over. So thinking about how an activity went in the day, how your large group activity went, or how your small group activity went. Did the children enjoy it? What new things did you notice they were interested in? What did they not enjoy? And why do you think they didn't enjoy that? So this is really good conversation to be having at the end of every day. It really should be happening daily. So for those of you who are in Head Start, we use HighScope. And those of you who are not, again, it's best practice. So HighScope says that daily you plan, daily you have these conversations, daily you look at how activities went, daily you discuss if they were successful, why were they were successful. You look at what the children found interesting, and you plan based upon that, and as well as their development. So if you are a teacher that's on your own, that's something you would just sit back and think about, and maybe you make a few notes about it so that you could plan according to that, to because we want to have successful experiences for the children. And so the way to do that is to understand their interest and their development. Then another way to observe and record is teacher observation checklists. Now, I would say these should be used very limited. Checklists don't ever give a clear picture. Like I can't look at a checklist and get a picture of what a child is doing. They can be helpful for identifying specific behaviors at times. For example, when I used to teach, there were times that I would take a checklist outside and we might have the children practice skipping or running or hopping, and I would make a check mark if they were able to do that. But even with that, it really wasn't a personal observation that was detailed. So if I was going to show their parent that checklist, I could say, yes, they could skip, or no, they couldn't. But if I were to write an anecdotal, it might say, when asked to skip, Johnny galloped, putting one foot in front of the other and hopping along in that way. So instead of just saying, no, they can't skip, it kind of tells more about where they're at developmentally. So while checklists can be helpful, they really are not usually a true picture of the child's development. And then there's portfolios or work samples. So these are really great ways to show a record of what children are doing. So these are collections of work that a child does over time. They can include drawings, dictated stories, attempts at writing words and numbers, and language samples, which are transcriptions of the exact words a child uses. to express a thought or idea. In addition, a series of photographs can provide a visual picture of the child at work. So when I taught, I did use portfolios, and I would collect monthly samples of the child's drawings, of their attempts at writing, different things like this. And so that not only I could see the progression, but the parent could when I did home visits and conferences. So that was really nice. And the parents always really enjoyed that because it gave them a visual. It wasn't just looking at that checklist that, okay, they can do this. It gave them a visual of where they were at. So yes, they're writing letters. Some are backwards, some are not, some are online, some are not. It gives them a clear picture of what their child can or cannot do developmentally. Also, pictures are great to use for many programs. I know that you use things like we have Core at Head Start where you can take pictures and upload them into the assessment for the child that the parents can see. I know at La Petite they have Bright Wheel where they can take pictures and upload those for the parents so they can see visually what the children are doing. And again, while I love photos and I think they're so helpful, there really does kind of need to be some kind of explanation often with them as far as what is going on when this is happening and the developmental stage that the child is in. So those are some ways that you can take records and observe. So let's talk for a minute about anecdotal notes. So what they do and what they look like specifically. So anecdotal notes, these are my favorite type of observing and recording. I think they're the most relevant, the most effective, the most helpful in recording the true developmental stage of the children. So they provide the evidence of the children's current abilities and skills. So evidence, this is the evidence of it. Throughout the day, you would jot down anecdotes that clearly describe what the children do and what they say. So you're going to be focusing on what the child does and on what they say. You again want to be factual, you want to be specific, and you want to be as brief as possible. Within the anecdotal note, you should always include the name of the child, the date, and then the when, the beginning of the time. So not the time of day, not like 8:50, but like work time, snack time, small group time, whatever time that this is happening within, you want to put that on there. And then you have the middle, which is actually what the child did or said. You want to make sure you're documenting their exact language in quotes whenever possible. And then if there's an ending, you would state that. So I'm going to show you an example here of an anecdotal note. So this is a really formal looking one. An anecdotal note, though, can just be written in a notebook on paper. For those of you who have access to iPads or whatever you may use to upload things, that's a really nice thing to have available to you. But if there's more than one teacher in a room, obviously the iPad can only be utilized by one teacher. So you might want some other options. But here is, again, a very formal one. But I do want to show you what it says and why it's appropriate. So at the top, you can see it has the child's name, Toby, and his age. The age is usually not necessary if you're doing an assessment because it's already in the assessment. The date is very helpful. You would want a date because when I go back and look at anecdotal records, I want to know if this child did this in September at the first of the year or in March. So again, I can see their progression and where they're at developmentally at different times of the year. It does have the educator's name on here who took the note. That's not absolutely necessary, but probably helpful. And then the setting is at the sand pit. They do have the time of day, 4 p.m. Again, that's really not necessary as long as you are stating what the schedule, the time of the schedule in that day is. Again, work time, snack time, whatever. So this one says, Toby walked over to the sand pit and picked up a toy truck. Carrying the truck with both of his hands, Toby walked over to 2 of his friends who were also in the sand pit. Toby said, I got a dump truck. There is more over there. Get one too, he said to the others, pointing to where the trucks were. Toby sat in the sand pit, put the truck in front of him, and used his hands. He began to scoop up sand and fill the back of the truck. When Toby filled the back of the truck, he pushed it across the sandpit while kneeling. Too heavy, hard to push, he commented. Toby stopped pushing and then began to empty the sand from the back of the truck. Once the sand was completely off the back of the truck, Toby pushed it across the sandpit again. Look, I can push it fast now, he said. Okay, so this is a rather long anecdotal, and there are times when they will be necessary, but you'll find most of your anecdotals will not be long. And again, I'll show you some of those here in a little bit. But think for a minute about what the point is of this anecdotal. Hopefully you have realized that the point of it is problem solving. So it needed to be rather long to show how he did problem solve. But you can see as I read this, it painted a picture in your mind, right? A very clear picture of what happened. Now, I do think it should have said during outside time, although it's kind of obvious, but still, again, we want to have that on there. And so this helps us know very clearly where Toby's development is and how we can build upon that. And when using an assessment, it allows us to clearly mark him in the assessment where he's at developmentally. So when we think about anecdotals, first of all, we want to make sure, again, we're writing objective, not subjective. So I'm going to read you a few anecdotals here, and I want you to decide which one is objective and which one is subjective. So I'm going to read two anecdotals about the same child. Here's the first one. Mateo was riding around on his toy and wanted to go into the main classroom. Mateo rudely shouted, "Pass!" at Karen and Rory. They moved quickly out of his way and he rode past them without saying thank you. Okay, here's anecdotal number 2 about the same situation. Sitting astride a ride-on toy, Mateo rode up to a small group of people. "Pass," he demanded. Looking up, Karen suggested to Rory that they both move over. Once they had moved, Mateo rode past them into the main classroom. So when you think about objective being factual statements and subjective adding judgments, would you say that number 1 or number 2 is objective? Number 2 is objective. If you go back to number 1, it says Mateo rudely shouted. So we see that a judgment was inserted into that. And so that makes it subjective. The second one said, "Pass," he demanded. So that tells us that he used a demanding voice, but it's not labeling it as rude. Okay, let's try another one. Again, I'm going to give you 2 examples. Mary and Jane are building a blockhouse. Jane knocks over the house. Mary puts it up again. Jane knocks it over a second time. Mary says, "I'm not going to play anymore." Mary goes to the doll corner, picks up a doll, and rocks it. Okay, here's number 2. Mary is playing with Jane. They are not playing well together because Jane keeps pestering Mary. They play only a short time before Mary goes to play alone. She does not like to play with Jane. So that one's pretty obvious. The first one is the objective one. The second one has a lot of judgments, that they're not playing well together, that Jane's pestering Mary, and she makes the assumption that Mary doesn't like to play with Jane. So again, we have to be really careful to take our opinion, our feelings, our thoughts out of anecdotal notes when we're writing them. So I would like for you to take out your paper and pen for a minute, and I'm going to give you 3 different anecdotal notes. And I would like for you to rewrite them in a way that you feel is objective. So the ones I'm reading to you are subjective. So I want you to change it to an objective anecdotal note. So this one says, after lunchtime, Shelley was whiny and started crying to go home. So I want you to change this to an objective statement. Okay, so it starts out well after lunchtime. It's telling when it happens. But then it makes the judgment that Shelley was whiny. So what we could say is something different, like Shelley. Okay, I should have practiced this before, but you would say something like Shelley appeared sad. Shelley started to ask to go home. She was crying when she asked this. So you might, so let's say that again. So after lunchtime, Shelley started crying to go home. She was asking for her mom over and over in a very sad sounding voice. So that would kind of portray that she was upset and wanted to go home, because that's obviously the case here. And we don't want to label her as whiny, even if we feel that it sounds whiny. So the point of this would be to say, to express that probably after lunchtime, Shelley gets tired and she starts missing her mom. So that would kind of be the point of that observation. So you have to think about what the point is of the observation when you're writing it down. So here's another one. While outside, Tommy waved to a man he never saw before and said hi. How would you rewrite that objectively? So this doesn't paint a very clear picture, right? So you would want a clear picture. So I don't know, maybe it would say something like, while outside, Tommy waved to the delivery man and said hi. That gives a clearer picture. Or maybe you would say, while outside, Tommy waved to a man who was walking outside the gate and said hi. You would want to give a clearer picture. So the point behind this is probably that Tommy's really friendly, even to strangers. So again, thinking about what the purpose of the anecdotal note is and how you want to express that, and that it paints a picture. Let's do one more. At work time, Jacob found his favorite truck on the shelf and drove it around the room. Okay, so the subject statement in this is favorite truck. So what we want to do is to imply that it's his favorite without making that judgment. So what we might do is say, at work time, each day, Jacob walks over to the shelf and takes off the red and blue truck. Then he drives it around the room. Or we might say, each day this week, Jacob goes over and does that, whatever. But then it implies that that is his favorite toy without making that judgment. Because the point is, we want it to be known that Jacob has a preference for this, that he enjoys that truck and that activity. Okay. So now let me go back to that one really quickly that I just did. And I'm going to change it to an objective. At each day at work time, Jacob walks over and grabs the red and blue truck off the shelf and drives it around the room. So would I have everything I need? I didn't tell a date. I would need to have a date. Did it have a beginning? Yes, at work time. Did it have a middle? Yes. He walks over and grabs his truck. An ending, you could kind of say it is, but or not, but drives it around the room. Again, that kind of varies on the situation and what you're observing. Was it specific? Yes, it was specific. Okay, so we want to make sure that we have all those things in place when we're doing anecdotal notes. Now, suggestions for how to take anecdotal notes, because this can be tricky. It can also be stressful. If you are a program that requires assessments on a regular basis, for instance, Head Start does. Typically, there's anywhere from 15 to 20 children in a room if you're preschool, and usually have 8 children in a room if you are infant toddler. And within that, there are many, many domains for observing the children. And what is required is you're required to have an anecdotal note on every domain for every individual child. So it can get really stressful at times to try to keep up on that. But we are federally funded, and we try to prove what we understand about the child and their development, and that we are meeting their developmental needs. And so assessments help us to do that. So finding ways to do this successfully is helpful. And so here's some suggestions. Possibly you could choose to focus on 4 or 5 children each week, specific 4 or 5 children. You always want to remain open to targeting to observing every child, but you just might want to target just a few each week for extra attention. Like maybe during work time, you're going to go work with those specific children, or during outside time, you're going to involve yourself in their play, or you're going to really focus during small group or large group on these children. And so that can be helpful. That's a way that you can do that. And also, let me say this, for the Head Start girls, every teacher should be taking anecdotal notes. And you would typically set it up in the way that whoever your small group children are, those are the children you are responsible to make sure that their core is done on time. So you would still, if you see an anecdotal note, an anecdotal child, you would share that with the teacher that is responsible for their core. And then you would decide together whether or not you're going to input that on that child or they're going to. But every teacher should be putting anecdotal notes into core and scoring children, not just 1 or not just 2, unless you only have 2 in the room, obviously. So that's something too, even if you're not Head Start, that you would want to split the workload and share that. It makes it a lot easier. Then you want to decide how and where you'll record. So each day you need to have a plan about that. When's the best time for me to record? Now, if you're a teacher by yourself, that's a little bit more of a challenge. So you're going to have to really be kind of strategic about that, about where you're going to place yourself during work time or outside time, or even during your group times. And, have your iPad handy if that's how you take notes, or notebooks or note cards. And really and truly, you really should have note cards and notebooks handy too, because we know sometimes it takes time to get on the iPad, put in the codes, get it ready, get to the right setting, where you can just write a quick note. And also, again, for those of you who have more than one teacher, the iPad's not always available to everyone. And oftentimes the teacher should be making recordings at the same time. So having different ways to record on hand is helpful. So you might have a topic you're looking for, especially if you have a purposeful small group or large group time planned, then you are probably looking for a specific skill at that time. Or maybe you're going to target a certain child with the standards at that time. So just have that in your mind, have that ready, be looking for that. And then write it down right away. Please have those materials available and handy. I know you think you won't forget, but you will. You'll forget. Back when I was a teacher and when my brain was young and healthy and good, functioning better than it does now, there would be some really awesome things happen. And I would think, I'm never going to forget that. That was such a great anecdotal. And guess what? I would forget. So I got in the habit of really, really having that paper handy and having different ways that I would record. So if you're like me, you've also found that there are certain areas that you tend to see more than others. And sometimes it maybe comes down to the wire and it's time to, like maybe the last couple of weeks, and you're trying to get your assessments done. And you notice every time it's these same areas that you don't have done. So what I would sometimes do is I would take a file folder. So we'll pretend this is my file folder. And within it, I would take sticky notes, enough per child. So if I had 15 children, inside I would have 15 sticky notes. And then I would have the topic out here that I was looking for. And within that, then I would have the names of each child on those sticky notes. And I would write down the observation about this. So I had that handy and ready until I had that on all of the children. And then I would transfer that later. And that was really helpful for me. That was a way for me to be accountable about getting that note on every child for that specific skill. Let's see here. So that can be really challenging, I know. But and everybody's different, everybody's unique and individual, but I want to encourage you very strongly to make individual notes about each individual child with those skills as much as possible. Really and truly, when you're doing the core, at least 80% of your anecdotal notes on your children should be individualized to your children. And we're going to talk more about that in a minute. So assessments, what are they? Well, they're the official ways that we record our observations. And so there's a lot of tools available, a lot of them. So one of them that a lot of our Missouri preschools access is the Missouri Early Learning Standards. So let me bring that one up for you here. So this is part of the Missouri Early Learning Standards. So this is one of the domains they have, approaches to learning. And then it breaks it down in showing curiosity and how they do that. And then it breaks it down by infants and by toddlers. It tells you even what you might do. It tells you what you might see. And then it tells you what you might do based upon what you see. Okay, then it goes into preschoolers. Here we go. Under approaches learning, again, there's the taking initiative piece. So it really breaks it down for you. And for those of you who do not have formal observations, I would really encourage you to go in, and you can just download this. Just go to Google and type in Missouri Early Learning Standards, and it will bring up the PDF of it. And so it's going to show you here all these different components of approaches to learning. And it's going to take you through all those pieces. And then once you get through approaches to learning, there's another domain. Let me get down here really quick. Social emotional. Okay. So it's going to take you through all these different areas of development that children need and break them down for you, where you can really, really just focus in on where they're at developmentally and where you need to take them. Oops. Okay, there we go. Again, I've referred to the core many times because that's what HighScope uses. And this is the physical form that we have. We also have it online. But here you can see all the different domains and then all the different areas underneath that it touches on, very similar to the Missouri Early Learning Standards. Created curriculum uses the gold. So there's just a lot, okay? But they measure the development of children in areas like social development, physical development, cognitive development, literacy, language, creative development, and science. So again, really important in purposeful planning and meeting the needs of our children. Okay, so I'm going to take a minute here and I'm going to show you some videos. They're very short. They're about 1.5 to 2.5 minutes long. And I want you to practice taking anecdotal notes on them. Okay, just so you can get a feeling for how that looks if you're not used to doing that. Okay, here we go.
Miranda, how did you know how to write Caroline's name?
I told me.
She told you the letters?
C-A-R-O-I-N-T. I don't know how to write my whole name. How does my whole name go?
Well, where's our chart? Where's our list?
I read them. I did I did that one. That's not my whole name. Get my list. Get it right now.
Okay, I'm going to stop that right there. And so let me talk to you just for a minute about this. There's a lot going on here. So depending on what you're wanting to use the anecdotal for, you could record different things or you could record the whole thing. But I'm just going to pick out something here. I'm going to say during work time, Miranda referenced a card with her name on it to write the letters in her name on a whiteboard. So obviously, I would be using that to for the literacy piece of it, right? To see where she's at with her literacy and recognizing letters and able to write them, right? But it could be used for other things because if you notice, she was also naming some of the letters. She also problem solved by getting the name card, right? So it could be used for so many different things. So oftentimes anecdotals can be used for several different developmental skills. So depending on what you're using it for is how you would write that. You want it, of course, to be factual, but what you're going to include in it is going to be based upon what you're needing to record it for. Personally, I would record probably most of what happened, and then I would use it for all of those areas. It will save you having to get other anecdotals on those different skills and yet be very effective because that was a very great example of all those things I talked about. Okay, so let me share again. We're going to look at another video.
Alright, said Papa, we'll give it a try. So he packed up a thermos of raspberries, and some chocolate marshmallow fudge delights. Junior took a big ball, Jakey took a surfboard, and the baby took her 3-speed wind-up paddle wheel boat. Papa turned key. Vroom, vroom, vroom. Clinkety, clankety, bing, bang, pop. They were off to the lake in the rabbit trap car. They didn't go fast and they didn't go far when the time went. My mom hates that. My mom does too. Never mind, said Judy. I know just what to do. She put her beach ball on the car and stuck it on tight with chocolate marshmallow fudge delight. Papa turned key. Lumpity, bumpity, clankety, clankety, bing, bang, pop. They were off to the lake in the rattle trap car. They didn't go fast and they didn't go far when.
Okay, I'm going to stop it again. So in this one, again, taking an anecdotal note, again, it could depend on what you're wanting to take the note about, but it can touch on several areas. So you might say, the girl, I don't remember her name, read a book to 2 peers from memory using inflection in her voice. You know, you could do all kinds of things. So then when I'm looking at the core assessment here, I'm going to reading, of course, as just very obvious at first. And so under reading, there's a lot of different options depending on the child's development from 0 to 7. And so it says here, child reads, in quotations, a picture by labeling what he or she says. And then the next step says, child reads 2 or more words. Oh, no, I'm sorry. The next one says, child identifies what a common symbol represents. So I would put this child where it says child reads a picture by labeling what he or she sees. So she's reading from memory based upon what she sees. But then that shows you that the next level that she would need to reach is identifying what a common symbol represents. So then, since she's interested in reading, you might start wanting to show what the D represents or what different letters represent, so that she can start actually identifying letters to eventually get to the point of reading. But it shows you when you have an assessment where they're at and what's next, where you could take them to. Another thing that I would identify with this child is under social studies. So under social studies in the core, there's knowledge of self and others. And if you move down to number 3, it says child plays or talks about family or community roles. So the child next to her said, I don't know if you noticed this, she said, my mom does that. My mom does that too. So she was identifying something within her family that was familiar, that connected, that communicated that. And then, so it tells you what's next so that you can plan what's next. Okay, so that's really helpful. Can you see how it's helpful to have anecdotal notes to really zero in on where children are out and what the next step are, so that when you're planning, it can be really meaningful. Okay, we're not going to watch the third one because I think you get the point. But again, you do want to make sure when you're taking those notes, I just want to remind you that you have the time, the date, because so like if this little girl's doing this from memory, I want to know if she's doing that in September or again in March. Because if she's doing it in September, then I'm hoping that in March, she's really way further along. She's identifying letters at this point and different things. And maybe even identifying some words in a book, which some preschoolers can do. Okay, so now talking again about observations, and this is observations in core, but whatever assessment tool you're using. Again, they should be personalized and specific to the child. Rarely should anecdotes be used for the whole classroom. And this is the high scope, just like, I can't even think of words today. My mind is crazy, but like the standard for high scope, that you would use specific individual anecdotes. So I'm going to give you an example of an anecdote that I've seen used before. So this one says, during large group, the children danced to music and talked about how they moved. And this was put on pretty much every one of the children's core. So this really is not useful for that individual child. So if I go to the child and it says, during large group, the children danced to music and talked about how they moved, really doesn't really give me a clear picture at all of what the child did or where the developmental skill is. So all the children were dancing and moving and talked about how they moved, but how did my child dance and how did they move? How did they talk about it? It really doesn't give me any clear picture of that at all. So if this is the activity for the large group, that's fine, but you need to individualize the anecdote. So it would say, during large group, Stacy danced to music, moving her body back and forth, swaying back and forth, or stomping her feet and while walking around the carpet, something like that, and said, I'm stomping my feet, I'm swaying back and forth. Those types of things. It would be specific to the individual child, because we know that every child is not going to dance and move the same. Some skills are going to be more developed than others, and even in how they talk about it. Some children are going to label their movements in different ways. And so that not only helps with me identifying them and under movement, it could also help me identify under language and their understanding. So many different things. And it might even come to the point where it would identify social skills. So if a child held hands with another child and danced and moved in the same way or copied another child, you can see where this is a very generic anecdote. And again, I want to express that I understand that at times it's hard to do individual ones because of time, because of behaviors and what have you. But that again is where planning comes into play and is so important, that you plan how you're going to take anecdotal notes. And maybe you set goals for yourself. Maybe you set a goal that each day you're going to take 3 anecdotal notes, not per child, just 3. Or maybe 5, or maybe you're going to take 2 anecdotes per child per day. I don't know. It depends. I mean, if you have a classroom of 20 children, it's probably not reasonable to expect that you would take 2 anecdotal notes per child per day, right? But if you have 3 teachers in the room, that's reasonable. And if only 7 of those children are yours or 6, then that's reasonable, right? So thinking about that and keeping yourself to that schedule. Now, I don't know what will help you to stay accountable and to stay on task. Only you know that. But I would suggest that you do that so that you can really have accurate, purposeful assessments that truly show where your children are at and what they've accomplished. And a lot of us don't really like assessments. At least we don't like the work that goes into them because it is time consuming, right? But I actually really did love assessments as a teacher because you're with children day in, day out, day in, day out. And sometimes you don't recognize their progress unless you see it right in front of you, unless you see that picture that you paint it with words and you see that they moved from a 0 to a 3 or even a 0 to a 1. And then it not only um, shows you what you did, it validates what you did. It shows you that what you're doing is meaningful, that what you're doing is making a difference. On those days when you feel like all you're doing is running around putting out fires, when you look at that assessment, you can say, no, you know what? I did make a difference in these children. They did learn some skills and that they would probably not have learned had they not been in my classroom. So if you can look at it that way, it's helpful. Again, it's not something we love, right? We do not love assessments. They are not fun, but they really are necessary to have quality classrooms that continue to scaffold children and just increase their developmental skills. Okay, that's all I have for you. So have a good day.